Welcome to I'm Your Target Demographic, and welcome to our video introducing folks to the basic concepts of painting miniatures. This is basic and intro level stuff, so if you're a painting pro, this may be very familiar. In parts 1 and 2 of the series, we covered the various games that utilize miniatures to paint. Then we covered how the models are different and where to get the models from. So now, we're at the stage where you've got some models to paint, or you know you're going to purchase some. So what do you do now? And what sort of terms do you need to know? As I briefly mentioned in part 1, you'll want to get some tools, such as a clipper and a small hobby knife, to help if your models come on any sprues. Even if they're not on a sprue, you may have models with mold lines, which are flashes of plastic or metal that aren't meant to be on your model. So you'll need to clean them up and make things smooth, if they're meant to be smooth. We're also going to talk about basing a bit. So the literal base that your miniature is attached to. I usually attach my models to the base before painting, but this is totally your preference. Some models have what are called integrated bases, meaning your miniature is in a dynamic pose so that they're attached to the base, while others have flat feet and can be attached to any normal base, no fuss. Once you've decided to include the base or not right now, you'll then prime your model. You'll want to invest in a spray can of what's called primer. Don't use just any spray paint. I'd recommend paying a little bit more to get something specifically designed as a primer for miniatures, such as ones made by the company Citadel, which is a subset of Games Workshop, or the brand Army Painter. That's what I typically use. The color that you use is up to you. Black priming is great, since if you miss any bits, a black prime will hide some mistakes. White priming is best if you're going to be painting something a bright color. You can also use any other color if you think it makes sense and they create a primer in that color. An advanced technique of priming is called zenithal priming, which is a black primer and then a white primer from above or from the source of light hitting your model. This means that if you paint in light layers, one shade will look lighter and darker inherently because of the prime underneath. Using a zenithal technique is pointless if you slab on a thick coat of paint over the whole thing, so go lightly. You'll want to invest in a set of paints. There are some great deals on boxes of paints that include a well-rounded variety, and even starter kits from some companies that include models and paints. You'll also want a variety of brushes, from very teeny tiny brushes for details and some broader brushes for large areas. You're going to put this paint on a palette. A traditional palette is dry, just a plastic piece that you mix the paint together in. There's also what's called a wet palette, which is something you can make or buy, which incorporates a wet layer underneath your paint to keep it from drying while you paint. Now, there's a lot of techniques that people will reference when painting miniatures. So we're going to go through the popular ones so you know what people mean. A very common phrase is to dry brush. This technique means you'll put color on your brush and then wipe it off something like a paper towel until it's almost gone. You don't want to use your nice brushes for this. Once it's mostly gone, you'll paint swiftly over a textured area so that the paint will slowly get on the rises in the texture and not deep into the recesses. This is an easy technique for things like fur and scales. Another common phrase is to layer, meaning you'll transition from one color to another, building up to the color you want at the edge. Layering is usually smaller lines and details, so not as broad or reckless as dry brushing can be, much more controlled. You'll layer up to the highlights where the light is hitting your miniature the most, or layer down to the shadows where it's the darkest. We usually assume the light source is the sun or somewhere off the model, but there's also a technique called OSL, which stands for Object Source Lighting. This means you might have something on your model that is creating a light. It could be a torch or glowing eyes or a flaming sword. So creating an OSL effect is creating that look when the object is casting a colored light onto the rest of the model. Easy to understand, can be hard to perfect. Layering and doing things like highlights is usually doing a color and then, like the name implies, layering the colors. Another technique for transitioning colors is called wet blending. This is where you might transition from dark to light, for example, but you're mixing and blending the colors before they dry. Now, these are techniques, but there are also special types of paints that you can buy which serve very specific purposes. My favorites are called washes. Washes are incredibly thin, water-like paints that you literally wash over an entire area. It seeps into the cracks and textures, making things pop like crazy. If you want an immediate bump in quality, learning to use washes is the easiest first step. You also have thin paints called glazes. These are more intended to cover an area, but to darken or change the color of that entire area. You might put a thin red over an area to give it all a red glow without covering the color underneath. There are also multiple types of clear paints. If you're done painting, you might put a sealant or sealer over your entire model so it doesn't scratch as easily. They also make gloss varnishes that can make your model look shiny or wet, ideal for effects like crystals or water details or even blood effects. If you have a standard base and you want to snazz it up a bit, you might use some basing textures like a cracked earth effect or even snow effects. These are typically sold in bottles just like paint, but they work very differently. You don't need to buy all these, but if you know you're creating a snow-themed army or encounter, getting a bottle of snow effect will likely really make your models pop. So these are the super basics. I'm still learning, but hopefully you found this interesting. Down in the comments, let me know if there are words or phrases you've heard that you wanted to add or discuss. You can also find my miniature painting over on Instagram at IAYTD Painting and scope out the models I've been working on recently. Again, I'm just learning, so be nice. Thanks for watching, everyone.